You're listening to Let's Talk Creation with Todd Wood and Paul Garner, the creation show where we learn, grow, and worship.
Well, welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Creation with Paul Garner and Todd Wood. I'm Paul Garner.
And I'm Todd Wood.
It's great to be with you again. Don't forget to like and share our episodes, subscribe on your favourite podcast streaming platform or on YouTube, and leave us a comment or a positive review. All of that is much appreciated, so thank you very much. Todd, today we have got another one of our viewer Q&A episodes. We've done one of these before, and it was a lot of fun. People send in their comments and their questions, and we store them up, and every now and then we will try and get through as many as we can. So that's what we're planning to do today. So I think it's going to be a lot of fun.
Definitely, yeah.
But before we actually get down to the questions, I've got a bit of a surprise for you. Right. So if you hold on right there, just for one moment, I'll be right back.
Surprise! Oh, look who's here! All the way from jolly old England. He's here. All right. Well, I guess we should set up for a live episode of Let's Talk Creation. So
I'll go pull up a chair.
Yeah, I'll see you in a moment. Well, here we are at our cabin now, and our little fun flying over Paul is done. So now we are actually live in person together in the same room. It's a miracle.
Yep.
Pretty nice. So yeah, Paul's gonna read questions and we're going to answer them as we please. And that's how it's gonna go. And Lord willing, all of this stuff is gonna continue to work properly and there won't be any technical problems. Yeah. All right.
Well, let's kick off with a question that I know more than one person has asked about.
Oh, boy.
And this concerns dinosaur soft tissues.
Oh, my. Yeah.
It's one of those perennial questions, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
That comes up. So tell us, what are your thoughts about dinosaur soft tissues? Do you want me just to kick off and give a little bit of background about this?
Why don't you give a little background about that? I mean, I've done a little bit of reading recently, but you may know a little more about it than I do.
Okay. Well, yeah, maybe. But because you're a biochemist, I'm kind of interested in your reflections about this.
My take, sure.
I think that this whole topic deserves an episode of its own, really, because
several.
Several episodes. Yeah. It's a huge topic. And I guess much of the excitement began back in 2005, I think it was, when a paleontologist called Mary Schweitzer discovered what appeared to be remnants of red blood cells, blood vessels in T-Rex leg bone.
Yes.
I think it was from the Hell Creek formation.
It was from the Hell Creek in Montana.
Montana. So she published that, I think it was in the journal Science back in 2005. And it sparked a huge amount of controversy.
You could say that.
Lots of scientists were understandably extremely sceptical about this, that soft tissues could be preserved for such a long period of time. There were some sort of counterpoints that were published saying, well, what actually has been detected here are bacterial biofilms. So these were bacterial films that were sort of mimicking the soft tissues, but the soft tissues themselves weren't actually present. So there was that kind of pushback. Mary Schweitzer published further work where I think she sort of helped to confirm, what she'd discovered. There was some work done on the hadrosaur fossil, I think.
That she did some work, yeah. I think she was involved in that.
Yeah.
Somebody was involved in it. There was a hadrosaur that was also...
And that was actually a little bit older in conventional terms than the T-Rex bone. I think it was about 80 million years. I think the T-Rex bone was meant to be about 70 million years. And again, there were sort of proteins and
what appeared to be these sorts of things, and they were all soft and flexible and squishy and
so there's been this sort of then slow acceptance, I think, that what she found was actually original to the fossil, and then this has led scientists to try to work out, well, how can we preserve these kinds of tissues for that period of time? Right, so various kinds of hypotheses have been put forward to explain how you can basically preserve tissues that ought to disappear fairly quickly, ought to break down, ought to degrade fairly quickly. How you can preserve them for long periods of time. That probably is about the extent of my sort of knowledge, because I haven't read the literature very closely. But there have been a number of other discoveries published subsequently, where other soft tissue discoveries,
other things. Yeah, and if you've seen Is Genesis History, about the project sponsored by the Creation Research Society, where they've done this, basically repeated the research with, I think it was a Triceratops horn.
Yeah, that's right.
Triceratops. So the CRS sponsored this second project, and it was this Triceratops project, and they basically did the same sort of research and showed, sure enough, you can get this spongy, squishy tissue. So what do I think about this as a biochemist? I will tell you one thing that I think about it is that biochemical... So if you think about this in terms of a clock, which is what I think most creationists want to do. They want to say, there is no way over 65 million years you could possibly have preserved all of this dinosaur tissue.
Sure.
It would have degraded. And so the fact that we find all this soft tissue means it's not 65 million years old. And it's tricky business when you're trying to extrapolate that far back and make reasonable conclusions about, is this really, does this degradation pattern hold for that long? I think it's different when you have physical things with a physical decay constant, where you can see, uranium decays at this rate, and you can calculate the decay rate to very high precision because it's very regular. Whereas with biochemicals, it depends immensely on the environment, right?
Yeah.
So is it possible there could be some weird thing that preserves biomolecules over 65 million years? No idea. I have no idea. Would I be terribly surprised? Probably not. On the other hand, how are we going to ever test it, right? Unless we build a time machine and go back into the past and put something somewhere and come back to the present. It's impossible to test. So it's one of those things where it sort of comes down to a plausibility question. Do you think it's plausible that this could happen? And a lot of scientists think it's implausible, and some scientists think, well, here it is.
Yeah. So how certain are we then, Todd, that what has been found are actually remnants of original biomolecules? Is that a settled question, or is that still open for debate? Would you say?
Oh, it's always open for debate. Yeah, all of this is widely open for debate. So lots of different ways that they've tried to analyze these things. They've used fluorescent technology. They've used antibodies. They've used mass spec. I think they've used mass spec. They've looked for decay products of the kinds of biomolecules you should find, and so forth. So are they sure it's really the original dinosaur stuff? It depends on what you think sure is, what your level of certainty actually is. Now, years ago, when I was still more active on my blog, I wrote an article that really annoyed a lot of people.
You do surprise me.
Which was my purpose in writing it. And the title of the writing of the article, as I recall, was "Ancient Biomolecules Are Boring." And the point of the article, the first part of the point of the article was that there's a lot of uncertainty in these decay rates. So who can know for sure, right? And with the flood, you have a lot of hot water and a short amount of time. Those are going to cause degradation really rapidly. So I felt like it would be kind of a wash between the creation model and the long age, the 1,000-year preservation model versus the 1,000,000-year preservation model. But, who knows, right?
Yeah.
We can only see proteins. We've only been able to study proteins in really good ways for less than a century now. So who knows how long they can go. So, so that was kind of a thing. And the other thing that I said in that article is that it's just sort of an interesting, it's really cool, but what do you do with it, right? So you found some dinosaur protein. Congratulations.
Yeah. The other question that's always been in the back of my mind is we know that there are some more, what I think everybody recognises more geologically recent fossils. So let's say Neanderthals.
Yeah.
Where we can reconstruct a whole genome,
right,
essentially.
Right.
So we have quite relatively well preserved, a lot of material.
Yes.
And whether we find these soft tissues in dinosaurs or not, we don't have that level of, that quality of preservation in those fossils.
Right. So you can't get a dinosaur genome. You're not going to get it out of insects in amber.
Okay.
You're not going to make a Jurassic Park.
No. So there's no Jurassic Park kind of scenario.
No.
So then, even in the creation model, we've got to explain why there's that difference between those more recent fossils and the dinosaurs. And what you were saying there maybe about the conditions of the flood, do you think that might partially explain that?
That might partially explain it, but here's the kick that's happened since I wrote that article that's making me change my tune. So, when you find a really well-preserved T-Rex bone that has presumably T-Rex protein and biomolecules in it, that's mildly interesting. And now it seems to be that everywhere we look, any dinosaur bone is going to have this stuff in it. Now that's becoming a systematic pattern. So now I'm thinking, okay, well, now we have something really to explain, a broad scale pattern. It's one thing to say, the typical explanation for the fossil records, occasionally things die and their bones don't get eaten and they get covered with sediment and then you have fossils. And it's all perfectly random and this amazing lottery. You win the lottery if you have that.
Yeah.
But when you start seeing so many in one place, you start to think, okay, well, these guys didn't win the lottery. They've figured out how to work the system, right? If you buy a lotto ticket and you win once in your lifetime, that's one thing. But if you keep buying them and you win every time, something's up, right? Yeah. So that's kind of the analogy there. And so now, we've gone out, they found this, and it was freshly excavated when Schweitzer first did it, and really well preserved. And so they looked into the leg bone to see what they could find in terms of biomolecules, and there they were. And so that's winning the lottery, right? But now it seems that every time you go to a bone to look for it, you find something like this.
Right. I've read cases where people are saying, we used to think this was really exceptional conditions.
Yes.
And now we're finding this stuff even in degraded old bones that are kicking around in a museum drawer somewhere that haven't been preserved under those exceptional conditions. So that's interesting.
And you start to think, okay, now we have to think about something quite different, because now it becomes not a matter of, under very special circumstances, you can preserve dinosaur proteins for millions of years. Now it becomes, you don't really need any special circumstances. They're just there.
Yeah.
And so now I think, okay, well now maybe the clock has some more, that might be more interesting.
Yeah.
Right? If it was just one or two things here or there, then I would shrug my shoulders and say, who knows? It's, sometimes you win the lottery. But when you have it all the time, now you start thinking, okay, well, something fishy's going on here. And maybe that does have, that's going to be a project for future researchers to figure out, what does all this mean and how does it fit into the creation model? Is it really telling us that the dinosaurs are preserved more recently? Or are these bacterial biofilm people going to make some sort of progress? I doubt it. There's too many different types of evidences that have been shown to be in these bones biochemically that are not things that bacteria do. So what are my opinions on this? Initially it was sort of that's cool, but what are you going to do with it? And now it's more of well, that's very intriguing that we keep finding the same thing over and over again.
Yeah.
So I've come around to thinking, okay, there's something going on here. Yeah. And I'm glad people like the CRS kept hammering away at this to show that this is the case. It is not simply a one-off happenstance that we happen to get this, that it's all over the place. So that's valuable to me. That's quite valuable. And so, who knows what the future holds. Yeah.
So I think we've probably covered that enough for now. But it's something maybe we should come back to in other episodes, because it is an intriguing topic.
Definitely.
And I think what we're saying is it's intriguing.
It's extremely interesting.
It comes down to this sort of question of plausibility. But it's actually, we need a lot more research to actually know what to do with it. And,
I think so.
How to make it into a kind of an argument. So, so that's interesting. Okay. Well, let's stay with fossils.
Okay.
And again, this is a question which lots of people ask.
Okay.
I've lost count of the number of times when I've been out to a meeting, given a talk on the fossil record, and somebody asked this: why are there no pre-flood human fossils? Where are they all? If the fossil record is a record of the flood, and it was designed to wipe mankind from the face of the earth, where are the human fossils?
Well, maybe they got wiped from the face of the earth.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So one thing I would say to that, and my usual beginning to that question is that it's kind of the wrong question.
Right.
Because you're just asking about one form of life. What happened to all the people? Right? Why don't we have Fred Flintstone riding his Brontosaurus or his Apatosaurus? And one model of the fossil record that creationists have been working on for quite some time, oh goodness, it goes back to the 30s, is this notion of ecological zonation. That what you're seeing in the fossil record is not a progression of time, but it's a progression of ecology. Mm-hmm. And when that was first proposed, it was proposed as an elevational model. That the farther up the fossil record you go, the higher up in elevation you would go in the pre-flood world.
So this was Harold Clark in 1946 in the New Diluvialism.
There you go.
New Diluvialism.
Yeah.
That's a hard word to say, diluvialism.
Diluvial, yeah. It is.
Doesn't trip off the tongue.
No.
But that was his model, and he's got that kind of fold-out chart, hasn't he, in his book.
Quite famous.
Showing this ecological zonation model.
And now other paleontologists have sort of picked up on this, and they're sort of thinking about it in geographic terms. Where if you think about the modern world, the real differences that we see are more regional. The big differences that we see are more regional. It's not that you have mammals confined to a particular elevation. It's that different mammal groups are in different continents. Right. So the creation model of the flood, the creation model, one creation model, there are different views on this, but one model is that what you're seeing in the fossil record is actually continents. So if that's the case, then where are all the human associated everything? Where is the livestock? Where are the crop plants? where are any of these things.
Mm-hmm.
If you put the flood boundary, high up in the fossil record, you get pre-flood mammals.
Right.
But you end up having this weird problem like Marcus Ross discussed,
Mm-hmm.
and we've discussed this on previous episodes, where you have animals going back to where they were buried, where their ancestors are buried before the flood, which is really odd. So you get the mammals in the fossil record, but you get this weird pattern of animals going back to the graves of their ancestors, which are buried deep underground, and they have no idea that they're there. So that's weird.
That's weird, yeah.
If you put the boundary lower, you don't have that problem. You get a bigger paleontological discontinuity where you have a pretty sharp break, right, at the KPG boundary, but you end up with no mammals at all. Well, not quite true. The kinds of mammals we have today.
Most modern mammals not
in the fossil record at all.
Yeah. There's some weird Mesozoic mammals.
They are very strange, as you've noted. They are more like, well, some of them are pretty sophisticated, but most of them are little mouse teeth. Right,
and an increasing diversity of Mesozoic mammals, it has to be said.
Precisely, yeah.
Filling lots of different ecological niches. They're not all just little scurrying rodent type things, that like you used to see in the dinosaur books back in the day.
Right.
So there's now this sort of increasing understanding of Mesozoic mammal diversity, but they're not modern types.
Right, they're not modern types at all. And we should mention here, we talk about rodent types or mouse types or...
I don't mean they're actually rodents.
They're definitely not rodents. They're definitely not mice.
Yeah.
You might think they are looking at them.
Yeah.
But they're really odd.
They're really odd, yeah.
They're really quite different.
Yeah.
So, that's to me the bigger puzzle. The bigger puzzle is the ecology of humanity is not preserved in the flood at all.
Yeah.
So why would that be? And once you sort of put it into that framework, you can start thinking about possible explanations.
Yeah.
If the fossil record is the result of burying certain geographical provinces by virtue of the way the ocean currents are flooding the land, you can easily, I think, imagine a circumstance where you have the place where the people are and their livestock and their crops is in a place where everything's just washed out to the ocean and doesn't get buried at all. So that it just rots and that's the end of it. And it's not preserved at all. I think that's a really interesting possibility. But the problem I have with it is, of course, it's all pure speculation because we're trying to account for a lack of data. Why don't we have this?
Yeah.
So it's like why the evolutionary biologist has to posit why you don't see a constant stream of transitional forms in the fossil record. Oh, well, the fossil record is very sporadic and it only preserves certain things at certain times. And so you come up with this model that explains why the fossil record doesn't really show the millions of transitional forms you'd think it should. That's the same kind of problem, right?
Right.
You've got a lack of data according to your model, and you've got to come up with some essentially ad hoc mechanism to explain why.
Yeah. Now, this issue of there not being any pre-flood human fossils, I think, is an issue for all of the major sort of flood models, because wherever you put that post-flood boundary, even if you put it very high, I think most creationists agree that those Pleistocene human fossils, they're post-flood. They're in post-flood context. Yeah. They're buried in caves or lake sediments and things like that. And I think actually it's kind of a weirder problem if you put the boundary very high, because if you put the boundary high, you have mammals and flowering plants.
That's true. Yeah.
And all of those things, but you don't have the humans. And I'm thinking, what kind of mechanism is going to selectively remove the humans so that they're not preserved and yet preserve mammals that they're living alongside and so on?
Yeah.
So that's kind of a difficult problem. If you put the flood boundary lower, say around the Cretaceous Paleogene, which is the model that you were talking about,
right,
then actually I think it becomes a slightly more soluble problem in that you're missing what looks to me like a whole coherent ecosystem, a whole bio. So you've got humans and you've got mammals and you've got the flowering plants, and that looks like an ecosystem that you could kind of make sense of.
Sure.
And it's missing. Now, we're still left with the problem, as you say, what happened to it.
Right, sure.
But to me, that seems like a kind of coherent question in a way that just the humans on their own seems rather odd. I wonder whether we even need to think about something more radical than just washing them out to the ocean. Because one of the things that we're also missing is any evidence of pre-flood civilization. And this was actually another question. We can probably kind of
just wrap it all together.
Talk about these all together, because another question that we had was about, we know from the Bible there are references to people who worked with metal before the flood.
That's right.
So where's the evidence of pre-flood technology? Where's the evidence of pre-flood civilization? You know, where are the buildings and the tools and, you know, other things that the humans produced? Yeah. And I think this has all got to be part of the same problem.
It has to be.
And washing the animals out to the ocean is not going to get rid...
Carcasses would work, but you can't get rid of metals.
You can't get rid of the metals and things like that. So I wonder whether we need to think even more radically. And, you know, one possible idea that and again, this is pure speculation. And you think, how on earth do we even begin to sort of, you know, get any purchase on this? But what about if the humans were living right alongside a subduction zone that kind of operated during the flood, that was so catastrophic that literally that whole ecosystem, maybe the whole continent, got sucked down a subduction zone and recycled into the Earth's interior? Now, I don't know enough about the geophysics of the Earth's interior and how we image these things to know whether you could maybe detect something like that in the seismic images of the Earth's interior. There are slabs. Yeah. There are slabs that we detect in the Earth's interior that look like it's ocean floor that's gone down. Could we detect what the difference is between, say, continental crust and...
Does continental crust even subduct, though? I mean, it's very light.
It's light.
That's the problem.
Well, this is the thing. I think under usual circumstances, you'd have to say no. Of course, it doesn't. It floats, and so it doesn't get sucked down.
But maybe they weren't living on continental crust.
Maybe they weren't living on continental crust, or maybe they were, but the circumstances were so uniquely catastrophic in that case that something really unusual happened. I don't know, but I think you have to think about something quite radical to explain the absence of all of that evidence. Yeah. And it's uncomfortable because we're trying to explain an absence of evidence, as you say.
Yes, which is always leads to a lot of hand waving and a lot of. Yeah. Unfortunately, a lot of people who get the idea that, I've solved all, I've got it all, just subscribe to my newsletter and I'll tell you exactly how it happened. Stop.
Yeah.
Don't get taken in by that kind of sensationalism. But you're right. I think when you make it a bigger problem, then creative solutions like that start to become more interesting. Because when you have a very selective problem, like, just the humans and just their technology and just their crops and just their animals, their livestock were the ones that gone from the flood record. Yeah. Don't know how. Yeah. That does become a really weird, and you just, and of course creationists are prone to just saying, God wanted to wipe them out, so he did. And then that's just the end of it, which never is very satisfying to me.
Yeah.
But I would say one other thing that we ought to mention here. This entire conversation has been based on the idea that people understand that all the human fossils we have are, in fact, after the flood. And I know another common question I get a lot. Are the Neanderthals the Nephilim? Could these people have been buried in the flood? Those kinds of questions. There are lots of good reasons to think that's not the case. There's lots of good reasons to think Neanderthals are not the Nephilim. There's lots of good reasons to think that they are post-flood. A couple of them that I can share with you really briefly. One would be the majority of Neanderthals in Europe, and by majority I mean like 3/4 of the Neanderthal sites in a survey that I did recently are caves, and those caves are carved into flood rock. So, and these aren't just random scattered Neanderthal bones. We have places where there's clearly been a body that's been laid down, and we have most of it preserved there. We have hearths and other living surfaces that we can see in these caves. So these are places that Neanderthals were living in. And so you can't live in the pre-flood world in a rock that doesn't exist, that was formed by the flood. That doesn't work, right?
Right.
And the other thing that we note from this, and this I've seen this in a couple of sites where you can see sort of the progression of geology and the progression of the rock record there. So an example, there's a widespread flint rock system in the Holy Land in Israel that geologist Andrew Snelling says this is probably flood rock because it is so widespread and so thick. And it is the source of a lot of the flint that's used to make the stone tools that are found in various locations in the Holy Land, in places like Gesher Bennett Yaakov and Ubaidiyah. And these are not just your random flakes where you could imagine rocks getting banged together and making, flakes. These are hand axes and well-shaped and well-formed stone tools. So if they're making stone tools out of flood rock,
right,
that must be post-flood, right?
You would think so.
You'd have to, because you can't make stone tools from flint from before the flood if the flint doesn't exist yet.
Right.
And you might be wondering, how do you know that this is the same flint? Because we have a thing called X-ray fluorescence, which now can tell you to a very precise degree the exact elemental composition of a rock without even bothering to break it open or do any weird invasive analysis. So you can take a stone tool, hit it with X-rays, it'll tell you exactly what the elemental composition is, and that's like a fingerprint. You can tell, okay, it came from there, and that matches that quite precisely. And we even have sites, we have at least 4 locations in northern Israel where we have the remains of the quarries where they were taking these rocks out, smashing them into smaller pieces and hauling them away. So all of that together tells me, okay, well, if these people are making stone tools out of stone formed during the flood, then these people must be after the flood.
Yeah.
So those are 2 reasons why we can be really pretty confident that people really are, these fossil people are really after the flood.
Yeah.
And so they're not preserved in the flood.
Yeah. And before we kind of move on from this question, because it's a very interesting one, I guess some people might be wondering, well, haven't we found fossils of humans and human artifacts in flood rocks? And of course, we touched a little bit on this when we did the Paluxy River episode, where we talked about the Paluxy tracks, which were one of those classic evidences of humans in flood rocks. In this case, not bodies, but trackways, footprints. But there have been occasional claims as well where claims have been made about human
persistent claims,
skeletons and things in Cretaceous rock and things like this. But I think all of the examples I've looked at, I've become quite persuaded that these are the Cretaceous skeletons. I think were intrusive modern burials, basically.
Yeah, or the claim simply doesn't exist.
Or the claim doesn't exist. Yeah,
it's just a newspaper report that has no.
Yeah,
the specimen's gone. everything about it is gone. So you only have this.
Yeah, you just have an eyewitness
Who knows what this is, right?
Yeah. And the other thing is with some of these artifact claims as well, we have the same problem.
Exactly.
Sometimes you know, even if you've got the artifact, unless you've actually got it in situ in the rock, how do you know it actually came from the rock if it wasn't well documented at the time it was discovered? And then there are others where I think, well, you know, was that even really a human artifact? So I think particularly of a claim where someone supposedly found a gold chain in coal. Now, as a geologist, you know, one of the things that you know about coal is that a very common mineral you find is iron pyrite, which is fool's gold. It's a very common mineral in coal deposits. So did somebody find some iron pyrite in coal and think this was a gold chain or some kind of gold artifact? You know, again, unless you can really document these things well, then we have to be a bit skeptical, I think.
And I think the audience that's how you should think about these things, right? Because a number of years ago, when I started Core Academy and first got onto Facebook so we could build an audience, I ended up in some strange discussion group, creation group or something like that. And they were talking about the Smithsonian was hiding evidence of giant humans. They had all these giant human skeletons that they were hiding and weren't letting people know about.
Right.
And so I said, okay, well, how do you know they're doing this? Well, there's newspaper reports of these discoveries. Okay, but how do you know the Smithsonian is hiding them deliberately? Well, I don't know. You know, they're just hiding it. And I thought, okay, well, but how do you know? Right? There's a disconnect there. If they're really good at hiding something, then how do you know they're hiding it? And if the best you can come up with is a newspaper report from the 1890s or 1880s, I would be very skeptical of that because it's not the highest quality of skeptical journalism back then.
Exactly. The newspapers were a bit of a wild west, weren't they? Back in the 1800s,
absolutely
they were publishing all kind of
whatever they could
stories
do to sell papers. So it's kind of like the mainstream media today. Whatever they can do to get you to click that headline. So,
and also, you know, even when you think about some of these claims like, you know, gold chains in coal and that kind of thing, I'm thinking, does that even really make very much sense from a creationist perspective? So, you know, if, for example, we're right about the way that coal was deposited, that it was in effect the remnants of a pre-flood floating forest where humans weren't living. I mean, they wouldn't have been living in this floating forest. Would it make sense to then find human artifacts in the fossilized remnants of that floating forest?
So picky about these things, Paul. You just got to make everything make sense. Right. Yeah. I think that's a really valid question. And then the other thing, you know, if you find just a random, I found this random whatever it is in Cretaceous rock. I found a random shoe in the Triassic. We have a claim of a shoe fossil from the Triassic. You got to wonder, okay, so we've got all of these fossils from the Triassic. Not a single human among them. No. Except for this one shoe. Right? Yeah. So something's weird about that. Either you've hit the lottery, or it's just not what it seems to be. Right. And and it's kind of, I'm seeing a parallel here to the whole biomolecules thing, right? Yeah. You find biomolecules in one T-Rex leg. That's interesting. Maybe it's special. Who knows? You hit the lottery. But when you find them a lot, then you start thinking there's a real pattern. Yeah. And this is one of those situations where these discoveries, they're never systematic. No. You don't find a lot of, you don't find a site where there's just this whole host of human remains in the Cretaceous. It's just not there. No. It's always these one-off weird things.
One shoe print, you know, in the Cambrian with a trilobite in the heel. You know, how would that work? In a marine shale. Right, yeah. Right. And, you know, it's not part of a trackway. It doesn't actually have the features of a human.
And you can't go back to that site where it was found and find more.
Right.
Right? There's nothing else there. It's just one thing.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of thing that makes me kind of sort of skeptical.
I even saw this is one of these things that did the rounds as a meme on Facebook, where there was what was purported to be like a human track in granite.
Oh, in granite, yes.
In granite. Now, how would that work? I mean, right. So, tell us a little about granite formation. We've talked a little about this, well, you have. So granite's an intrusive igneous rock, which means that it forms at some depth below the Earth's surface. Mm-hmm. So it forms as a magma. So a magma that is generated by partial melting of the Earth's lower crust. Okay. And then it ascends through the crust until it reaches a kind of point of thermal equilibrium in the upper crust.
So it's underground.
Cool. So it's underground. It's maybe 2 or 3 miles down. When it crystallizes. So how do you get a human footprint in this granite? It doesn't make any sense at all. The geological context is all completely wrong. So whatever these shapes are, they're just random erosional features, but they're not human tracks. So
Okay, well now that we've destroyed all the favorite arguments of our audience, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
but not really.
Sorry about this.
Stop using those arguments. Anyway,
well, we should talk about something other than fossils. I think. Here's a fun one. This is about the podcast itself. We've had a couple of questions about this. We had somebody who just said, you should debate evolutionists on the channel.
Oh, yeah, right.
And we've also been asked, are you planning to have any guests who are not young age creationists on your channel? Now, I've got some thoughts about that. It's something we've talked about.
It is something we've talked about.
So, do you want to kick us off with that one?
Sure. I don't really see us ever doing a debate like YouTube would love, right? I know we would get much more exposure if we did that. Yeah. We would get our numbers would go up to the tens of thousands instead of just the thousands. But I tend to think debating is more about the process of debating than it is about actually wrestling through with the questions, right?
Yeah.
So that you're never allowed to just say, well, I don't know, that's a really good question. We should think about that. And maybe here's some options, but I don't know which one is right. That's the kind of thing that scientists want to do. But a debater would find that to be a total failure.
Right.
Failed. So we're just not that kind of podcast. That's my first reaction. So no debates. Not like that anyway.
Yeah.
On the other hand, we have talked about other people that we don't agree with on the podcast. You brought up the specific idea of people who are not young Earth creationists. I can also imagine other areas of disagreement. I could imagine perhaps we reach out beyond evangelical Protestantism, right? Should we talk to some Catholics? Should we talk to some Orthodox? Should we talk to people who just have no interest in this debate at all?
Right.
That are just interesting theologians to talk to? Or should we talk to people who are just full-blown evolutionary scientists who don't care about creation, but they have a really interesting study that they found? Now, those folks I doubt will ever be able to persuade me.
Right.
Yes. I just like to talk to people about really interesting subjects. So my inclination is yes. The question is, how do we do that in a way that's sensible for the style that we are and the audience that we built?
Yeah.
Now, I don't want to underestimate our audience because they're pretty smart, I think.
Yeah.
Judging by some of the questions and comments we get, I think they're quite ready for branching out into other things. But the format. How do we do it? How do we do it in a way that's respectful to everybody, but we're not going to simply give someone a platform to promote their weird ideas, right? I don't ever want to do that.
So we are a young age creationist channel.
Yep.
Unapologetically.
Always have been.
And that's what we're going to remain.
Yeah.
So that's not going to change at all. So I think one of the things I'd say is we want to reassure people about that.
Yeah. That's a good point.
We are not changing our position or anything of that kind. We're not going to become just a general kind of apologetics channel where we have lots of different views on creation and everybody can make up their mind about it. We are a young age creationist channel, and we want to promote young age creationist ideas. But on the other hand, and we're not a debating channel. That's the other thing, as you've already said, we're not a debating channel. I find sometimes debates are interesting, but I find more often than not they're kind of unsatisfying. And you can win debates for all kinds of reasons that have nothing to do with actually the truth of the case that you're presenting. So debates are not our thing. I'm not a skilled debater. I don't know whether you've ever done debates. I don't have any interest in that. No, I don't really have much interest.
I would be perfectly happy to say I don't know, and then I would lose the debate.
Yeah. And I think we're not interested in just courting controversy for controversy's sake.
Correct.
Much as I know that would get us clicks. There's always a fine line, I think, when you're doing a podcast like this. We want to be serious and thoughtful about what we're doing, but we also want to grow an audience. The problem is those two things are often in tension.
Yes.
Because there is a tendency to want to sort of go for the clicks, and that means clickbaity sort of titles and guests and topics and things like that. And we're not really wanting to do that. It's not. It's just not our style. I mean, we're not like that really. On the other hand, I think there is a place, perhaps, for thoughtful, respectful dialogue with people who disagree. Not just, like you say, not just wanting to give people a platform to kind of for their own ideas, but where there's a genuine topic we can talk about and engage with in a sensible way. I think there might be a case for having guests who've got interesting things to say that we think are interesting for creationism, but the person expressing those ideas might not themselves be a creationist.
Yeah.
I think that might be a possibility.
Sure.
So, and I think of, the things that you've done with the Fool and the Heretic book, and the way that you developed that friendship with Darryl Falk, and that kind of thing. So, I could see there's scope for some of those things in the channel. We've trod very carefully because we haven't wanted to sort of frighten people too much, and that's why I wanted to reassure people. We are young age creationists. Our position is not changing. This is what the channel's about.
Yep.
So anything that we do along those lines is going to be because we think it's of interest to us as young Earth creationists. So yeah,
it's a tricky business because
it is.
The genre of these kinds of discussion is always confrontation, conflict, or critique. Let's. I've got 10 questions. You're going to answer me on my podcast, whatever. And there isn't really a genre for. Let's have an interesting conversation about maybe some common ground that we can agree on, right? Or maybe we're going to explore the differences between our views without coming to a conclusion. How do you package that? How do you envision that to become an episode? And I don't know. I think we're still sort of trying to figure that out. And I would also say, another thing I would say, I don't have a problem with a clickbaity advertising.
Right. Yeah.
So I could imagine having an evolutionist, a theistic evolutionist, let's say, like Darryl.
Right.
And playing up the conflict. We're gonna have a big debate or something like that, and sort of marketing it as a more aggressive thing.
Yeah.
And maybe
Scopes
even
trial 2.
Yeah, Scopes trial 2. Maybe even
just when you thought it was safe to go back to Dayton.
But it's all a matter of finding that balance, and that's just a super hard thing to do because I don't want to deceive anyone. but I still want them to watch.
Mm-hmm.
And you talk about our podcast and the sorts of things that people respond to. Goodness. Our number one, our big performers are things that people have heard about. Where did Cain get his wife?
Yeah.
The Nephilim.
Yeah.
Leviathan and Behemoth. Those were big episodes or big clips that we have on our channel. And it makes me think, oh, let's do more of that sort of thing. But
yeah,
you know, my favorite episodes tend to be the ones that don't get a lot of views. Right?
Yeah.
Our 50th anniversary with the ICC retrospective, I thought that was both interesting and hugely important as a historical documentation of the record of how this conference came to be, the International Conference on Creationism.
You should go and check it out if you haven't watched it.
Absolutely, check that out. But it's not popular. It's not popular with all the cool kids or whatever they're doing. They're not watching that episode. So, yeah, it's a fine balance. But I think we're going to continue doing the mix that we do. We're going to do things that are common questions that people want to know, and we're going to continue exploring themes that we're interested in, and having episodes that are, I don't know, sort of branching out. I don't want to get away from creation, but like our episode on the Dead Sea Scrolls or episode on the Septuagint. I think those are really helpful contexts for us to sort of start exploring other topics. Yeah.
And actually that reminds me, you mentioned the Septuagint episode, and one of the comments we had on that episode, I think, was, you know, are we going to get somebody to talk about the Masoretic? Because obviously there's this sort of debate about, you know, which are the original numbers, and so the impact that has on biblical chronology and the age of the earth. And, you know, there are a lot of people out there who are sort of pro-Masoretic text people. And I guess my answer is yes, we do. We do want to get someone on to talk about Masoretic text. So
correct.
So we want to explore all aspects of this, and we will do that. It's just a matter of finding the right person to represent that position
and getting into that schedule
and getting into the schedule, because we have this really busy program. We plan a long way ahead.
We do,
and this took a lot of planning,
yes,
as you can imagine.
And then we have guests that we want, and they say, well, I've got this work to do. Talk to me in 3 months. Okay. So, yeah, regarding the Masoretic, I think it's really important for us to understand what in the world that is when we talk about it.
Yeah,
and where it came from. And we did invite someone to come talk about it, and he basically gave us that answer. Yes, that would be fine, but it's going to have to be
at some other time.
Yeah, some other time.
Yeah.
Not this time. So we're thinking about either waiting, which is not my favorite, or finding someone else.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Yep. So, yes. I love it when people ask those kinds of questions when we're already working on the answers. All right, I think we got time for about one more question on this episode, and then maybe we'll do a part 2 for some other time.
Okay. Is there anything in Scripture indicating that the curse extended beyond this world to the rest of the universe? Now, I thought this was an interesting one. So it's touching on the cosmic scope of the fall.
Yeah.
You know, what is the fall cosmic in scope? What was actually affected by the fall? I've got some thoughts about this. So I think there are, we can probably think of lots of different biblical passages that touch on this. I think that the fall has a cosmic element to it, a cosmic scope.
Beyond our planet.
Okay. And a few texts that I think sort of push me in that direction. A very obvious one would be Romans 8 about the groaning of creation. And I think when you look at that in context, it's talking about the whole of creation. It's talking about the whole of the cosmos sort of groaning. And in fact, even the Old Testament talks about the heavens as well as the earth wearing out like an old garment. And of course, at the end of time, the heavens and the earth are going to be renewed. So it looks as if the whole universe in some way is kind of caught up in that story of redemption, the story of creation, the fall, and then being redeemed.
Yeah.
And of course, we have references in passages, I think Colossians 2, is it, where Paul writes about all things, whether in heaven or in earth, being reconciled together in Christ. So I think there are sort of passages that, to me, have that cosmic scope. But what that actually means, I don't know that I've really thought that through very clearly, because when we look at, let's say, at beyond our Earth to our solar system, and you've got planets that are cratered and planets that look as if maybe they've undergone some kind of catastrophism, a bit like the Earth has undergone. How do we understand that? How do we fit that into the creation model? And how does that relate to the fall? How does it relate to the flood? Was the flood only confined to the Earth? Was the flood something that had a more cosmic scope?
Yeah.
So they're all kind of really intriguing questions, and they're quite complex, I think.
Yeah, you're right. I'm glad you had some answers to that, because I was thinking, I have no idea. I would say, thinking through this as you were going over those, because I think those are really interesting points you make, the new heaven and the new earth idea, that it's not just a new earth, it's a new heaven and a new earth. So we have a newness to the whole of creation. That's, I think, quite important. But I think there's long been a temptation in creationism to say that entropy, the law of entropy, is the fall. That began at the fall, and so everything began to fall apart. And it's associated with this notion of entropy as sort of an ordering in the universe, and then entropy then is where disorder comes from. It's where things fall apart. So if you don't, if you spend a month and you don't clean your house, entropy increases, right? That's the classic idea.
Yeah.
The difficulty I have with that as a biochemist is that almost all of the reactions that keep you alive as a physical being are driven by entropy.
Right.
Which is kind of weird. And it's a really, I think, kind of an esoteric point that you don't really understand until you really start getting into thermodynamics. And you realize there's basically two factors in the energy change of all of your metabolism, right? There's a heat factor called enthalpy, and there's entropy, the entropy question. And many of the biochemical reactions in your body that you need to live, it turns out the larger one of those two is the entropy. That's the one that's causing it to happen. So an example might be the formation of the cell membrane. This one's an easy one. I bring this up because it's relatively easy for everybody to understand, hopefully. I always say biochemistry is easy to understand, and nobody does. But if you think about the formation of cell membrane, you have this layer of lipids that are all very well ordered and structured. And you would think that would be the opposite of entropy. You must put a lot of energy into that to make that happen. But it will happen spontaneously. So you put the right lipids into water and you mix it up, they will form these layers randomly. You don't have to add any energy to it, energy to the system. And what's happening there is that when you have the individual lipid molecules in water, there's a lot of water molecules that have to order themselves around the lipid to keep it in solution. Whereas if the lipids just clump together, the water molecules can go be disordered. So it's not that the ordering of the lipids is the important thing. It's the disorder of all the water. The water gets to be chaos. That's what's driving it. And I could go on and bore the audience to tears with my discussion of metabolism. But nearly everything, synthesis of DNA, synthesis of proteins, almost all of that stuff is driven by changes of entropy. So if we didn't have the law of entropy, we as physical beings would have to be literally, physically something else. Mm-hmm. We would have absolutely no physical continuity or connection to Adam and Eve. They would have completely different physical forms, which you're getting into the realm of really weird speculation there. And I would much prefer to just say, entropy is really important and necessary for our world. And the disorder question is really easily resolved by having a source of energy that drives the ordering of the cosmos. But anyway, I got a little off track on that question.
No, that's
but I think it's important for us as we sort of think about what is the fall, that we do it from a perspective of good knowledge. You know, as a young kid reading creation books, I thought that entropy argument sounded pretty good. Then I went to grad school and studied entropy as a biochemist and realized, this isn't going to work at all.
I couldn't digest food, if it wasn't for entropy.
Exactly. So, that would be bad. So entropy is really important, and I owe my life to it. So thank you, entropy.
Well, talking of entropy, I think we are rapidly coming to
running out of time,
running out of steam. Yeah. So we're coming to the end of this episode. We've got loads and loads of questions.
We have.
So we will come back. We'll do
Yeah.
another recording, and we will come back to more of these questions. So that's it for this time, and I guess we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Okay.
Yeah.
So bye for now.
Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Let's Talk Creation. For more information, visit us at letstalkcreation.org, where you'll find an archive of past episodes and all our show notes. If you'd like to leave a comment or make a suggestion, you can find us on all the major social media platforms. Let's Talk Creation is brought to you in the U.S. by Core Academy of Science and in the U.K. by Biblical Creation Trust. As a listener-supported ministry, we are grateful for all of your financial support. Find out how you can make a contribution at our website, letstalkcreation.org. Also remember to like, subscribe, and share this episode with your friends. Thanks, and see you next time.